1 second, there we go. I wanted to remember to record our discussion. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to direct you to the chat box function at the bottom center of your screen. We will be taking question and answers from our panelists later on in the hour. And we'd like you to, as you come up with questions, you can go ahead and pop them in the chat box and I will be monitoring that. And we are recording today's discussion for those who cannot make it in person. The order for our hour, we're going to begin with an opening prayer. These are all staff members that you see listed on this slide here. Nora Pfeiffer and Sister Louise Lears will introduce our speakers and facilitate discussion. I'll be back on to facilitate Q&A and some advocacy efforts going on in the US. And later on, as we close our time together, we will hear from Jason Miller with our closing prayer. And with that, I would like to welcome Sister Louise, who will begin our hour. Is that right?
That is right, Janine.
Excellent.
And as Janine said, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are, we are delighted that you're joining our discussion about Franciscan climate advocacy after COP26, the UN climate summit that just ended in Scotland. I'm Sister Louise Lears, Director of Creation Care Advocacy for FAN, and this is the first in what we hope will be a series of exchanges on important issues with key members of our network. Excuse me. FAN would like to provide updates on issues and faith-based advocacy strategies, and then hear from participants around the country about local actions they are planning and considering. Today, we focus on the urgent need to safeguard, to restore, and to heal our common home, as Pope Francis so beautifully said. And as always, we begin with prayer. And I invite Nora Pfeiffer, our Director of Franciscan Justice Circles, to lead us in prayer.
Hello, everyone, sisters, brothers, it's so good to see you. We'll just take a moment to take a deep breath and recognize the presence of love and justice and mercy that is around us and allowing us to breathe today. This is a prayer for our sister, Mother Earth. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of our sister, Mother Earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of those who are impoverished and our Sister Earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you for grounding us in prayer, as we know that everything we do needs to be rooted in our prayer. We have two wonderful presenters with us who have agreed to help us understand what actually happened at COP26, what commitments the governments made, and what we can do in the United States to advocate for faithful climate justice. Brother Angelito Cortez is the Vice Director of the JPIC, the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation Office in the General Curia for the Order of Friars Minor. And Brother Angel has just, and I mean just, returned from COP26, and we are so grateful for his presence with us. Dalia Rakowitz is the Washington Director of Dayenu, a Jewish call to climate action. And Dalia has worked for years advocating for climate justice nationally and internationally. We've asked each of them to speak for 10 minutes, and we know that is far, far, far too short. But we wanted to make sure that we had time for questions and comments and the sharing of ideas after we hear from our speakers. Brother Angel, you were among the tens of thousands of people who attended COP26 and the 100,000 who marched in the streets outside. Can you give us a sense of what actually happened at COP26? What decisions were made? What was it like to be there in the halls and in the streets?
Greetings of peace and all good to my brothers and sisters in the United States. I just arrived from Glasgow yesterday, and it's really complicated to travel with all the requirements. But I am bringing hope coming from COP26. Although we have good news and bad news after COP26. I would like to begin with my experience as a Franciscan. I journeyed with our brother Anglican Franciscans in the local friars in Glasgow. And we began our 2 weeks journey with an interfaith dialogue. It's called Talanoa Dialogue. And we were hosted by, excuse me, our Jewish brothers and sisters. We had an interaction on what are our hopes and dreams in the interfaith movement. And we created somewhat a statement that we can bring to our world leaders. And I was given an opportunity to talk about my experience when I was still in the Philippines. And I think that's one thing that is unique with the advocacy experience when you work with our brothers and sisters in the different faith. We're not talking about differences, but we're talking about similarities. And that similarity is the problem of the planet. And as the COP goes on, one major problem that we experience is the entrance to the conference. Imagine thousands of people going in with the COVID protocols. We waited for almost 2 hours to enter the conference. And I may speak generally, but there are limitations. I mean, we are many there, but we have limitations in access and negotiations. So, and the sessions for the world leaders are too far from the civil society and the church movements and the youth. So I was really upset that not everybody are being represented in the negotiations. And I am happy that there are many people coming from the global south, especially from the vulnerable countries like my country, the Philippines. There are many indigenous people. There are many young people like we saw in the television, Greta and others who are familiar. But what is most interesting is even those young people who are unknown are there to talk about climate. And as I have said, we cannot really go inside even we have budgets. And then along the way of the negotiations, one thing that really bothers me is the compromise that we all know that we want to retain the 1.5 until we survive and until this journey. But some world leaders are compromising to 1.7 until the end. That's why they kind of extended the conference, because still there are countries who are not willing to let go of profit, but think about vulnerable people. And not to mention, number one is Australia. They're the number one among all the countries. And not to be surprised, the second one is United States of America. And the third one is Great Britain as the host countries. So these three major countries are playing a big role in COP26, but it seems they forget the responsibility to really think about the people who are there represented the global south. Number three, yeah, it's good that COP is well celebrated. But actually, there are many representatives coming from the US. We are very surprised that many celebrity politicians are there. But it's not the purpose. It's not about the popular people, but it's about the mandates that they're going to do. But again, we are not surprised that US stick with the decision of the government that nothing changed about climate finance or even giving any amount. But the good news is the Scottish government gave a very good example, delivering 1 billion of climate finance every year and 2 billion for climate resiliency, to be exact. What else? It's really hard to move. We need to have COVID tests every day. Imagine 2 weeks of COVID test. So there are talks about discrimination and everything because majority of people coming from the global south, they don't receive vaccine, they don't have the opportunity. So limitations are really evident. But what I would highlight is even though these things happen, we managed to have the opportunity to dialogue with people coming from the different vulnerable countries. We call it the People Summit, especially in the second week. Although it's not inside the COP, it's outside the COP, but we are bringing issues. And I am blessed as a Franciscan that I am one of the representatives to talk with the Vice Under Secretary of the UNFCCC. So we brought some very good issues about including the faith-based organization into COP26. So in advocacy, that's our call, that the constituency of interfaith will be included in the COP26 process. We also brought the talks about resilience and empowerment. We talk about finance, which is a critical role, especially in terms of fossil in the society. We talk about loss and damage. In the middle of the COP, as a Filipino, we always commemorate Haiyan. We lost 10,000 people in one night, 1,000 until now missing, 1,500,000 houses were destroyed because of Haiyan. And you know, during the global action, there are some groups of UKIPs. They don't believe in climate change. And in the middle, they are calling that it's a fiction. So I was sorry for my colleagues in the global south, especially I have some friends who are victim of Typhoon Haiyan, and they have a strong arguments. And we're telling them that we're not telling about our emotions, but we're telling about facts that climate change is real because we already lost thousands of people. We also talk about gender inclusive climate action, that not only men should really talk about it in COP, but we're happy that there are strong women leaders who are there. So yeah, adaptation is also one major thing with the dialogue that we had. I think it's essential because we need to help people who are impacted to do capacity building after all their experiences. And of course, one major thing that is unique in this COP26 is the issue of climate change and human rights. You know, last October, as Franciscans, we work in the United Nations in Geneva with FI and others, that the UN Human Rights Council approved that there will be a special rapporteur on climate change and human rights. So we demanded that it will be included also in the takeaway of this COP26, that there will be a global recognition that climate change issue is a human rights issue. So that's one thing. And then, of course, just transition. We all know that we're calling for renewable energies, regardless of class, gender, race. We were calling for a more secure, decent life. And it's part of the just transition. But until now, like the victims of Haiyan, they're not having any good houses. They're not being helped by the government, because for them, it's like a survival of the fittest, that there are funds, but some governments are not transparent. That's why when we talk about climate finance, they're also talking about giving the money directly to the impacted communities. Indigenous people issue is also there, because 50% of the land issues are coming from indigenous people. Youth is also a major takeaway, because they are the future. So we should consider them always. And lastly, because I know my time is running out, global governance. I think like what they're talking about, COP is not a gathering of elitist politicians. We must stop climate imperialism, because COP is an opportunity to listen to people who are impacted and let the government leaders do what they must do. And they are really far-sighted. They're talking about 2040, 2050. But I believe the issue of climate change, we need to talk about and do radical decisions now. I think that's it, and I'll just add more later. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Brother Angel. That gives us a wonderful sense of what actually happened at COP26 before and during COP26. Dalia, the international faith community had a widespread presence at COP26, but we know the work does not end in Scotland. So what do you see for advocacy work in the faith-based community after COP26? And very specifically, what can we do in the United States to ensure that our elected leaders follow through on their climate promises?
Thank you. And it's a real privilege to be presenting alongside Brother Angel. Thank you for undergoing all the challenges of traveling to Glasgow and making sure that your voice, the voice of your brothers and sisters in the Philippines, and the faith voice came through at that global convening. Excuse me. Before I dive into what we can take away from the COP, I'm going to start by summarizing why this particular COP was so important, and some of the priorities and how we can further those priorities, the pledges that were made, and how we can further those priorities moving forward. So all eyes were on Glasgow because this COP was 5 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was structured in a way that countries would make pledges, and then every 5 years they would reevaluate those pledges and work to make them more ambitious, with the idea that we can go faster and bigger over time with more money, investment, technology, and political will. The United States has made a commitment to cut its greenhouse gas emissions under the Paris Agreement a little over 50% in the next 10 years. So that's its Paris pledge, 5 years in. That is not as high as it needs to be, but it is on its way. And the reason it's not as high as it needs to be, as Brother Angel mentioned, is that the call to action for this COP was keep 1.5 alive, recognizing that commitments that were being made by different governments and stakeholders were not going to be enough to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I believe is about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's what scientists tell us we need to do to avoid the most harmful impacts of the climate crisis. And we are certainly already seeing those impacts, as Brother Angel mentioned. And for all those who perished in Typhoon Haiyan, may their memory be a blessing. So the climate crisis is already real. And if we cannot stay below 1.5 degrees, it's going to get a lot worse. And then the other reason that this COP was so important is there was a lot of concerns, as Brother Angel mentioned, about who were going to be the people in the room, recognizing the challenges for those who are going to be most impacted or already most impacted to travel to Glasgow and be in the room. And actually an organization called Global Witness found that the largest delegation at the COP was from fossil fuel companies, so that there's already sort of a co-opting of that conversation. So this is what the stakes were already going into the COP, and what the hope was that the outcome would touch on essentially 5 different priorities, and all of those priorities have a lens of human rights and justice. So that is not its own outcome in and of itself. All of these have a dimension around human rights and justice. The first was a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. The second was to raise ambition, raise those pledges to meet this 1.5 threshold. We need to stay within 1.5. So governments have to agree to slash their greenhouse gas emissions at a scale and at a pace that will keep us within 1.5. The third is striking a balance between climate mitigation, which is trying to slow the progress of the climate crisis, and adaptation, which is recognizing that our climate is already changing and we need to be planning accordingly. So for example, mitigation would be moving away from fossil fuels to clean energy. Adaptation would be creating cooling centers in Phoenix, for example, where temperatures are already rising. A critical component of that is climate finance, which Brother Angel mentioned, which is the idea that there are countries that do not have the funding, the technology that is needed at this moment for that adaptation work, but there are other countries that are hoarding resources, they're hoarding technology, and it's their responsibility to foot the bill for the countries that don't yet have those resources, that are not as far along in their development, to adapt to the climate crisis. And then there's this critical piece around loss and damage. This is the idea that no matter what we do, some things cannot be saved. And as a result, we need to be compensating those countries and those communities for the loss and damage that they're experiencing. So those are our 5 priorities going into COP. I will share a little about where that landed and what that means for us in the United States. How can we make these priorities a reality in the US? So on our first goal on rapidly phasing out fossil fuels, on a positive note, there was a launch of a brand new alliance that is being led by Costa Rica and Denmark that's calling for a phase out of oil and gas extraction. The US is not a party to that alliance, but the state of California is. So if you are on this call and you live in California, Governor Newsom made that pledge, and oil and gas extraction is big business in California. So that was a positive step. But on a more disappointing note, the final text of the COP did not have very strong language around phasing out fossil fuels. There was some language, but that language was really weakened and whittled down by what Brother Angel mentioned. Australia, the US, they came in and said, you know, I don't know about that language. Let's be a little softer. So we need to rapidly phase out fossil fuels. And in the United States, you have President Biden saying that he's a champion for climate action. And this week, the US government is hosting a lease bid process for fossil fuel extraction in the Gulf of Mexico and in Alaska. So 1 week after COP, after the US claims to be a leader, they are auctioning off public land that could be used for fossil fuel extraction. So we need to call on the administration to ban fossil fuel extraction on public lands. And that is something the administration can do without Congress. And it's really about, do they have the political will and putting people before profit. So on phasing out fossil fuels, there was not enough that came out of COP, and the US could be doing a lot more. Second, on raising ambition to keep global warming within this 1.5 degree thresholds, as Brother Angel mentioned, we are nowhere near where we need to be. We are closer, but the current projection coming out of Glasgow is that we're more on track to be above 2 degrees, probably about 2.5 degrees Celsius. So we need to be moving a lot faster. We need a lot more ambition. On a positive note, the timeline of raising ambition has been adjusted. So in the past, every 5 years, the ask was for countries to make more ambitious claims. Now the adjustment is to revisit pledges every year. So that is a good sign. It will help us accelerate. But again, all of this is procedural, and it's going to be up to us to make this come alive. And it's up to us to hold our governments accountable. So in the United States, right now, we are on the cusp of passing climate legislation, the Build Back Better Act. This is going to give us the potential to spend $555 billion on climate. Again, it is not enough, but it gets us closer. So we need to pass that legislation, and then we need to make sure that that funding flows quickly to move away from fossil fuels to clean electricity, transportation, transit, and much more. So that's on number 2. I will also add there were some positive steps as well. There was a pledge to reduce global methane emissions, which the US did join. That is both regulated by the EPA and also can be there can be targets that Congress can pass as well. And so this relates to the Build Back Better Act as well. There may or may not be a fee on methane in the legislation. It's up to us to make sure that that provision stays. So that's something you can do when you talk about Build Back Better with your members of Congress, to fight for that methane fee so that polluters are not incentivized to emit methane. And for the EPA, we need them to be moving faster and more ambitiously. Essentially, what they put in place is not enough to meet the pledge the US joined in Glasgow. So there's work to be done in the administration, and there's work to be done with Congress. There was also a pledge to end deforestation by the decade's end. While that was encouraging, in some sense, it was just a recommitment of an earlier pledge that had been delayed. So again, this is work that the US needs to be doing both at home and abroad. So what funding is going to environmental protection efforts in development assistance? What livelihood funding is being provided? So lots of work to be done there. On this question of mitigation and adaptation and climate finance, very disappointing. There is so much more money needed. Countries have pledged $100 billion and they are falling well short. But the good news is that in the US, the budget for next fiscal year is being negotiated right now. So there's an opportunity to call your members of Congress and make sure that there is funding for things like a Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms that provide climate finance. So we have an opportunity here in the US, but the US and other countries are falling well short. On loss and damage, another big disappointment that Brother Angel mentioned is that there was no funding mechanism created for loss and damage. And that makes it easier for countries to shirk their responsibility. But a highlight was the creation of funding through the government of Scotland. They're going to be the first country to contribute money to loss and damage. So an opportunity to educate President Biden, his administration, and Congress on loss and damage. So that was a lot of information. I will close by saying all of these pledges are only as strong as our ability to hold our members of Congress, our governors, our local elected officials, our president accountable. And that's really where the work that you do comes in. The faith voice is so important. This is moral work, and we are powerful political stakeholders in our own right. We are not just providing moral imagination and inspiration, we are also powerful political actors. So we have a lot of work to do to raise the level of ambition of these pledges, but in order for governments and the US government to meet them, we have a lot of organizing and advocacy to be done here in the US.
Oh, Talia, thank you. And you are talking to a group that wants to do this advocacy in the United States. So from a faith-based perspective. I noticed, Janine, that we have some questions in the chat from participants and some comments. We also would encourage everybody, if you have activities that you're doing that are engaged in advocacy at this time around climate care, please let us know in the chat so that all of us can be beneficiaries of that wealth of knowledge. So Janine, can you
Yes.
moderate an exchange of ideas and comments and sharing of activities that are already going on?
I would love to. Thank you, Louise. Yes, both of you, such great information, and yet so little time to discuss all of it. So we'll dive right in. For Brother Angel, actually, one of the first questions, actually, this one came from my very own brain. On top, you mentioned the issues you had to go with as far as traveling with the pandemic. On top of all the important discussions that needed to happen, dealing with the pandemic must have been such a challenge. Were there discussions, either formal or informal, about the virus in terms of climate, ecosystems, things like that?
Well, as far as I know, it's really on the side. I mean, nobody's talking about it publicly, but they're talking about the effects on it vis-a-vis the conference and the situation. I myself, for example, my vaccine, I got Sinovac from the Philippines before I work here in Rome, but I need to have another vaccine here in Europe so I can move around. So it's like in my conscience, I stole an opportunity for somebody back home to be vaccinated. We all know that developing countries are having less opportunities to be vaccinated. But to go back to your question, I think uh, it was not discussed publicly, but because of the effects and all the things that we are experiencing, people are talking about it side by side with a lot of discussion, but not in general.
Got it. Right. Got it. Got it. Very good. Thank you. Dahlia, we had a question. Will the interest in electric cars have any impact with climate change or climate warming?
A great question, because in the US, transportation emissions are what is driving the climate crisis. The largest source of emissions in the US is coming from our cars. And so it is helpful that they are becoming more affordable. And what is very exciting is that there is a rebate in the Build Back Better Act that will make them even more affordable. So I think there's the question of accessibility. There's also the norms. The more people are driving them, the more they see them on the road, the more it becomes of interest to be driving those electric vehicles. But we know a big barrier is charging infrastructure. You know, people are nervous. They don't want to drive too far from home and their car breaks down. So again, in the Build Back Better legislation, there is funding for electric vehicle infrastructure in the form of charging. So this is why these policy solutions are so important, because they have a direct impact in people's ability to adopt this pro-environmental behavior.
Excellent. Yeah, that's terrific. Good to know.
And
good to know. Yes,
to
Father
give
Angel.
some fact, during the entire conference, we're using an energy operated buses. So I think Scotland did a very good initiative on doing that. So it's an example.
Great job leading by example. That's true. Yeah. Father Angelito, we also had another question about Typhoon Haiyan. How much effort did the various churches play in helping towards recovery of that?
Well, not to brag, but I think majority of the help are coming from the faith-based groups, including Franciscans and Catholic. Like, as a Franciscan family in the Philippines, we built a village for people who cannot go back to their homes. So, and then this village is not about infrastructure, but building again a church community with a goal of resilience and building capacity for the families who are impacted by Haiyan. But until now, sad to say, there's no transparency with the funds that the government collected. Billions of money were donated internationally, but that's it. I mean, I don't want to go further, but that's the reality.
You know what, that ties right into our next question though, Brother Angel. Dahlia, you had mentioned the fund for loss and damage. How exactly will that work? Do countries have to apply for the funding? How, and where do private donations go in, or maybe that wasn't part of the discussion?
That's a great question. And I will start, and Brother Angel, I will pass it to you. You know, one of the reasons that there was a desire for a loss and damage facility, for there to be an official process, is that those decisions can be made together. We know that making decisions in committee often, and in the COP forum, oftentimes leads to suboptimal results, but at the same time, you can ensure more fairness. There can be a standardized application process. There can be an understanding of, you know, what thresholds you need, what bank account you need to receive funding, what accreditation you need. So because right now, Scotland is the only one who's pledged funding, none of that has been worked out. And there, in some ways, there's no mandate to work that out. And even if the private sector wants to contribute funding, they too don't have sort of that established system to give money to. So that's how come these official processes help that money flow, even though sometimes they can be limiting and there are additional challenges that they raise. But Brother Angel, I'd love to pass it to you to hopefully correct or add anything I just said.
Yeah, I really agree with that, because I was talking with my colleagues that they really did not talk about this mechanism, but it's really important because Haiyan is a very good example. Like if we're receiving funds, but there's no transparency and accountability, especially in judging who are the deserving beneficiaries and deserving organization or community. So if we will rely to government mechanisms, well, we will end up again with having the new term, which is climate corruption of climate finance.
Right. Okay, another question coming in. Besides fossil fuels, what international focus was made on protection of global rainforests, especially the Amazon? Maybe again, we could start with you, Brother Angel.
Mhm. Maybe we could start with what's her name?
Dahlia?
Dalia. Yeah.
Sure.
So a great question. I am not as much of an expert in this area, so I will respond on a piece that I'm more comfortable focusing on, which is on Indigenous rights and sovereignty, because so much of the Amazon is the traditional land of Indigenous peoples, and they have long been stewards of that land. And as is often the case at these COPs, Indigenous peoples are more tokenized than they are listened to and viewed as political actors in their own right. There were some really powerful demonstrations. I know Brother Angel talked about the People's Forum to hear from Indigenous leaders, but I would say this is a chronic failing of the COP system. There's a lot of better work to be done. Specific to forests, I think that, again, the global pledge on deforestation was a good first start, but as I mentioned, it was something that countries had already pledged to do. So to some extent, they're kicking the can down the road, and they're not creating enough space to hear from impacted communities and those who've been stewarding these forests for generations and generations.
Right. And again, like you said, kicking the can down the road, and we need to hold these decisions accountable, hold our leaders accountable. Absolutely. Brother Angel, anything to add or?
Well, I think, yeah, that's important because I heard a powerful message from an indigenous girl from the Pacific. And she said that before we talk about climate change, we already have our ways on how to deal with it. But now you're talking about climate change in view of what is happening to us. But you are the one who are doing this to us, especially grabbing lands, grabbing their ancestral domains and everything. So I think the important thing there is the voices of the indigenous people is also represented, not only symbolically or romantically because they're wearing their costumes or their indigenous people clothes, but they are really represented in the climate talks.
Right, right. And, going backwards just a little bit, there was a question about whether the commitments made at COP26 are voluntary or are they binding? How is the accountability worked out?
Well, actually, uh, it's really, it depends on the person whom are you going to ask. But as a Franciscan, I think what is our hope now is they inserted or they approve already the issue of human rights and climate change. Because if we talk about legally binding mechanisms, the UN Human Rights Council is one of the powerful platform, as I believe, because I also go there for advocacies for human rights related issues in the Philippines. But now that there's a mechanism, then there can be a periodic review of every country who are committing climate crimes. It's not about what I said. COP is not about gatherings of elite political leaders or elite climate advocates, but there will be climate laws as the US is starting to talk about in relation to the UN mechanism.
Absolutely, absolutely. One last question for you, Dahlia. The Green Climate Fund, would that be destined internationally or domestically?
That is international. So this falls under the climate finance umbrella. And in the United States, it's become a little of a political football. Members of Congress have said, we don't want our tax dollars to go to communities abroad. And they've sort of used the Global Climate Fund as an example of a mechanism where money goes from the US to international actors. But this year, the Green Climate Fund, has its own budget line. So it's actually a critical fight because once there's a budget line, it's much harder to remove that funding in the future. So again, if you're someone who engages around the federal budget process, this is a great year to weigh in on the Green Climate Fund and climate finance overall. I will also just briefly, following up on this question around the UN Human Rights Council, I will flag that this resolution on the right to clean and healthy, sustainable environment that recently passed did so over the objection of the United States. The United States is not currently on the UN Human Rights Council, but the US and the UK both weighed in and said they did not support this resolution. So there's so many reasons that when we talk about issues around climate finance, Green Climate Fund, et cetera, we need to be framing it around human rights because there is a lack of understanding and some opposition within the US government to this rights-based framing.
Right, right. Wow, very good. Thanks for that. Just again, I wish we had more time, but I'm hoping for one last question for both of you. You can kind of answer the same question. What hope, as Franciscan-hearted people here in the US, what hope can we take from this? What message do we have to lead us forward? I don't know who wants to begin, Dahlia or Brother Angel?
I'm happy to start and give you the last word.
Great. That'd be great, Dahlia. Go ahead.
I would say that one thing that it's both disappointing but also hopeful is that what we saw at this COP was the conversation was no longer, is this real? Is this an urgent threat? It was, how are we going to do this and how quickly are we going to move? And even though we're disappointed in a lot of the outcomes, that is a big shift forward. And so as advocates, it's our job to take that open door and slam it open and make sure that we never go back. And if anything, we just go full steam ahead.
Brother Angel, what would you add?
Well, for me, I would like to end with the message of the Pope to COP26, even though the Holy See has a very safe statement. But he said, we can confront this crisis by retreating into isolationism, protectionism, and exploitation. Or we can see in them a real change for change, a genuine moment of conversion, and not simply in a spiritual sense. I believe that as Franciscans, we are not just lovers of Saint Francis because he is the patron of ecology, but we must walk the talk. We must be examples in our own little way that there's really a hope in this climate issue. We don't need to be a political leader or a church leader, but by our own ranks, in our own homes, we can really do something, because climate change is real. And as a lesson in Typhoon Haiyan, we can lose thousands of lives by just one click.
True, so true. Thank you both so much for your wonderful, wonderful comments. And I'm going to bring everyone's attention to the chat. Dahlia has popped in there some resource links and things which I encourage everyone to call your members of Congress on the Build Back Better plan. Absolutely. And just much appreciation to the two of you for being on with us today. Thank you so much. One of the other things that we wanted to bring about today was advocacy, what we can do to go forward. And we have in our audience today, I'm going to ask Laura Anderson to unmute herself. Laura Anderson is with the Clinton Franciscans, and she has given us her generously given us her time to go through something that you all have planned going forward. So Laura, take it away. What would you like to share with us?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. Dahlia, thank you very much, and go blue, by the way, and Brother Angel for your work at COP26, which is so greatly needed. I understand there were over 500 fossil fuel lobbyists at COP26, so not everybody there was on the same page as us. So we need everybody out there. So thank you very much. The Clinton Franciscans, that we were in Clinton, Iowa, a tiny town on the Mississippi River, took a corporate stand on Care for Creation in 2019. So we've been long, and since long before that, the Clinton Franciscans have been long involved in Care for Creation. So we're very big on advocacy. Legislative advocacy is a way of bringing about systemic change. I will put in a quick plug for our weekly email newsletter that we put out that's available to everybody, called the Action Alert Digest. It covers all of the social justice issues that the Clinton Franciscans have taken corporate stands on: death penalty, immigration reform, active nonviolence, nuclear disarmament, human trafficking, and of course, Care for Creation. So the digest is a brief newsletter that features 2 or 3 brief stories every week on these issues, as well as online advocacy opportunities. So we would encourage you to sign up for that, so you can find ways to contact your lawmakers and let them know that these are important issues that we all care about. The Sisters of St. Francis of Clinton, Iowa have, in addition to the corporate stand, have divested from fossil fuels. They have a garden and grow their own food. There's a huge property with a prairie restoration project going on. We have solar panels. The new administration building that was built a few years ago has geothermal heating and cooling. They have a fleet of hybrid vehicles. Of course, as individuals, they're all doing recycling, and we promote those sort of things. Rallied support from local community, from the State University Extension Office and the Parks and Rec Department to build a community garden a few years ago. But most importantly, right now, we're very excited about the new campaign from the Vatican, from the dicastery of, what is it, the dicastery of
Human development?
Human integral ecology, something like that, to bring Laudato Si, the Care for Our Common Home by Pope Francis from 2015 to light and into action. So there's this huge campaign for to unite Catholics and good people from around the world in 7 different sectors to get motivated about caring for creation. So they're reaching out to families, dioceses, schools, universities, hospitals and healthcare centers, businesses, agricultural farms, and religious orders. And the idea is that it's not just about climate change, but that there's an integral ecology that affects all human rights issues: care for the care of the earth, the cry of the poor, economics, the need to address adoption of simple lifestyles, education, spirituality, community involvement. So it's the Laudato Si Action Platform. I'll put a link to that in the chat if you want to get more information about that. It's a really exciting 7-year program that people are getting on board with.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was actually wonderful. I was wondering if there was any way that I could bring that in, and you did it beautifully. Also, again, bringing your attention to the chat, Brother Angel has got several links on there. I will make sure that we get all of this information into a follow-up email along with the recording of this very rich discussion that we have had today. I have not seen any other efforts or advocacy things that anyone has put into the chat. I had encouraged people to do that, but if you'd feel more comfortable speaking verbally, you're welcome to go into the reactions button on the bottom. Will allow you to raise your hand, and I can unmute you, and you can share with the entire audience here what you all are doing in your community. But I haven't seen anything else come through. Sister Louise, was there anything else as we wrap up that we wanted to bring to people's attention?
I think actually you brought to your attention, everybody's attention, that we will send out resources. We know that there was a great deal of information, and we want to make sure that you have the specifics around that information. So you don't need to copy too much from the chat. You don't need to take too many notes, although you may have already. But thank you to everybody. Thank you for all that you're doing in the way of advocacy, that some of which we've heard about, some of which we know is going on and we may not hear about. But we really are very grateful to all the Franciscan climate advocacy that is already going on and that will go on in the future. And Brother Angel and Dalia, we are particularly grateful to you for sharing your time and your experience with us.
Great. And we did actually get one hand raised. Jean Marie, oh, I'm going to butcher your last name. I apologize. If you could unmute. Thank you so much.
Like too risky.
Very good. Thank you so much. Please share with us what you are doing.
I'm a member of the Franciscan Sisters of Chicago, and we operate long-term care ministry across the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois areas. And what we have is a lot of ecological spirituality that we put not only in our own convents, but also in our ministries. So wherever we have facilities, we have gardens, shrines, and we have made them paved and accessible to the handicapped and elderly, so that you can take actually these electric golf carts to go out into the garden areas or the prairies. You can use your walker or, rollator or whatever. So for us, it's a very important thing that our seniors too are involved in this and feel that they can contribute and be part of making things good for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is absolutely wonderful. Great examples of what you can do in your own community. We're getting towards the end of our hour. At this point, I would like to invite Jason Miller, who is on staff here at the Franciscan Action Network, to give us a close in prayer. Jason.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janine. And thank you to our presenters today and to everyone who joined us. I'm going to close with a blessing that they used at the conclusion of COP26. It was an adaptation by Rabbi Daniel Schwartz, who offered a variation on a Jewish prayer for renewal traditionally recited in the light of the waxing moon. So we pray. We praise you, our God, provider and protector of all the world, who with your words created the vastness of the heavens, and with your breath all the life within it. You have given us times and seasons, rain, sun, and soil. May we live as to love and value these gifts, so that countless generations and myriad species may continue to wonder at them. Inspire the nations of the world, their leaders and their peoples, to not falter at our appointed task. May the promises made at this gathering be not only kept, but surpassed. until the promise of a sustainable and healthy future reaches the farthest corners of the earth, our common home. At this moment of opportunity and truth, may we fulfill your desire for justice and speak truth to power, our creator, worker of truth, whose work is truth. Just as the light of the moon is renewed and grows brighter, so may we move past the darkness of division and despair into the light of hope, courage, generosity, solidarity, and goodwill. Guide us to repair our imperfections speedily and soon, before the garden we have inherited becomes a desert we leave to our children. May it be your will, our God and God of our past, present, and future, that we end oppression and move forward united in a spirit of humility, mutual respect, and responsibility to each other and all of life. Blessed are you, fashioner of life, who endlessly opens the path toward renewal.
Amen. Thank you, Jason. Thank you all so much for being here. Sister Louise, did you want to say a final goodbye?
Just a thank you and go forward with our blessing.
Amen. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.